Okay, I'm gonna see if this is actually live streaming. So I'm getting mixed messages here. So hang on. Just gonna test it to see. And I apologize for the loud noise. Okay. Ha! All right. It is working now. Okay, cool. So make sure we mute that so we don't get feedback. I'm gonna try doing this
Your cell phones.
here too. All right. Hello, hello, ladies. It's been a minute. If you're watching this on Instagram, hello. If you're live over on YouTube, hello. Hopefully you can both see and hear me okay. I'm a little bit sick, so I haven't been like as involved in the conversation and things that have been going on. We've got sickness in the background too, and outside noise. So hopefully, again, I'm got my mic on. I'm gonna try and talk loud. Hopefully you can hear me okay. If you can't, let me know. But I wanted to explore and discuss a little bit with what has been going on this past weekend with women in the LDS Church. For those who aren't familiar, they're 182nd anniversary of the Relief Society, which is the women's organization for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That anniversary was on Sunday, and there was a worldwide devotional held with that and a testimony meeting. And there was an article that came out in one of the local papers here in Utah. Shoot, I forgot to check when the article came out, but a little bit before that, right? An article was basically suggesting women stay home from church as a way to sort of send a message about things that are important to women. And then on Monday, I believe it was, the Instagram account for the church posted a quote from the broadcast. And the comments just like blew up over the last couple of days. And like over 8,000 on there. And then the church responded today, and there's been some issues in people being able to see the comments. And so we're going to dive into all of that. But as everything around here, we're going to be also looking at some of the energetics. And that's one of the pieces that I'm hoping, whether you are having a really hard time with what's going on, if you're just sort of watching it, not really sure what you're thinking, maybe wondering why it's such a big thing for people, wherever you are in your experience, I just want you to know how much I care about you and whatever you are feeling, how much validity there is in that. And I'm going to try and speak to a few different perspectives throughout this conversation. So sometimes I may not be talking to you or your experience, and I hope that that's okay. Part of the point here is for me to be able to highlight lots of different viewpoints and perspectives to help us be able to move through challenging times easier. Right? So, other note on energetics for those of you who are not familiar before we like really start diving in. I love energetics. I love seeing these like intangible patterns that play out, and they're really cool when you start studying them, you start learning about them, you start seeing them in your own lives, because it can help in understanding why sometimes things are playing out the way they are, why they're occurring in certain timeframes, why things that we wish were happening aren't happening, why things that have happened did happen, right? I've created a model called the staircase model, and it's very similar to any industry, right? Uses models all the time, which is basically collecting data, putting it together, using it as a way to say, hey, these are common patterns and trends and things, and we can utilize that in a way to sort of help predict what are some of the possibilities of how things can play out. So we're going to be looking at the staircase model a little bit and how that plays into all of this. We're also going to be referencing the church's recent purchase of the Kirtland Temple and some other things that happened earlier in March. As part of looking at this pattern. So it's important to note and recognize and acknowledge, like, anytime we're talking about energetics, it's not a predictive thing, right? It's a way to sort of, like a map to sort of give reference for the different waves that are showing up, why they may be showing up, and how to navigate through it a little bit easier. Just take a zoomed out perspective a little bit too. So we'll be diving into that as well. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, feel free to ask them. If there's something in particular you want to make sure we discuss or that you're struggling with, feel free to put it in the comments here. Send me a message. I always love chatting, talking. Marco Polo is another great one. I love Marco Poloing with people. So if you're somebody who's like, I really need some help navigating through this, I don't have anyone to talk about, reach out. We'll talk. Okay, so with that, I think that covers our bases. Oh, other than the last one that I always like to put out there, which is obviously, I don't speak for the church. I don't represent the church in any official capacity, right? These are me sharing my thoughts and experiences and doing so in an attempt to help anyone else who's navigating through this. So with that said, I want to highlight a little bit for those who are, let's see, where do I want to start? So many thoughts. Okay, so one of the things that I think was really neat and why a lot of people are actually calling what happened on this comment on Instagram even a historic experience in a way, while others are viewing it as like it's nothing new, and others are sort of like, oh my gosh, it's not a big deal, right? So one of the things I want to speak to with that is that part of the reason this was so significant for so many women is there was really this like unifying voice that really came together for a lot of people. And it was kind of neat because the intention for that was kind of set by this experience seen in this article, right? Whether you were agreeing or disagreeing with staying home from church, not staying home from church, what that meant, I think the desire and the underlying, perhaps unifying thing that regardless of your thoughts or perspectives or experiences, we can all sort of tap into is that longing for a greater unified voice, right? And so whether you were feeling that and feeling like, oh my gosh, there are people who think and feel and these things matter to them and they're speaking up and they're talking about these things just like I am, and look at this flood of seeing that all in one place, all singularly together. And from what I saw, I didn't read all 8,000 comments, I just perused through a few of them, but it was generally in a largely positive and supportive way of people just speaking and explaining their perspectives or their opinions or their thoughts. And I think there's a lot of beauty in that. Okay. And so if you're one of those people who found hope in that, who was comforted by that, I just want to validate that experience and how beautiful that is. And for those who are sitting there struggling, going, oh man, there are just so many women who don't understand, like didn't understand what was being expressed in this talk, didn't understand the gospel, don't understand what we have, don't understand why these things are important. You might be viewing as just angry, deceived women, right? I want to really challenge that perspective. And the reason I want to challenge it is not to negate the other perspective either. Okay. I may get into some of my own personal thoughts and how I navigate things here, but what I want to speak to is that I really think this is a beautiful opportunity for us to recognize both parts of this conversation and the importance of both voices. So like I loved seeing the comments and the people who were speaking up and sharing, thank you so much for this message. I loved and appreciated it. This conference was just what I needed. Love you so much. Just as much as I appreciated those who were speaking up and expressing, this was really frustrating for me, or I would really appreciate these other things as ways to support me in the church. Right? And one of the perspectives that always comes to mind for me is I'm always bringing it back to parenting and childbirth. Because regardless of if you've had that human experience of actually raising children or birthing them, the pattern of it is something that I think is really applicable and a way to understand a lot of these things. And so when my kid is throwing a tantrum, right, there's a really easy tendency to look at that and go, so frustrated, like he's such a naughty kid, like I just can't get him to listen. I'm just right. And depending upon where I am, it can be really irritating to focus on that. Right? And I may be able to like gather myself, calm down a little bit and go, okay, he's 2, he's 4, he's still learning this. He hasn't learned this yet, right? And I think there can be a little bit of that perspective of, okay, these people are upset, they're angry. It's just because they haven't learned this yet. They haven't understand it. They don't have a testimony. They're not trying. Whatever sort of story, we can get into that similar mindset and place, which in this case, I don't think is actually productive. And we're going to shift out of the tantrum perspective into a different one here in a sec. But I want to stick with the tantrum analogy for a second, because when a tantrum is occurring, it's usually there because the child doesn't know what other way they're supposed to go about trying to get a need met, trying to express something that is missing to them, that they're needing, right? And when I can pause as a parent and go, okay, what is going on here underneath? What is that unmet need? What is that unresolved need? Then it stops into this like battle against us for one, and it moves out of that space of like, and again, parent-child is different, which is why we're going to shift into like adult perspective here in a second, because in a parent-child relationship, right, my job is in part to help teach my child, right? But if I can move down to that, there's like an even deeper level here. And it's something I'm still implementing in my parenting, but that I really love is wanting my children to help teach me how I can help them, right? So wanting them to express to me and say, Mom, this is not working for me. I would appreciate it being parented in this way. These are things that are supportive of me. I'm really struggling with this, right? And it starts creating that dialogue. And we're shifting perspective here. A dialogue and an experience and a change in the relationship where we're now engaging in a co-creative experience. Each of us has different roles, each of us has different pieces that we're playing, but we get to have that cooperative experience that's going on. And to me, that's the place where so much of this is coming from, is how do we have more of that cooperative dialogue and feeling like there's no outlet, right? There's so many women who I've talked to, who I've worked with, who I've coached, who I've cried with, who I've spent time with, right? And I know there's so many of you out there in a similar place, right? Reaching out to them. Maybe you're commiserating with each other, you're comforting each other. Maybe you found some solace in that. Maybe it's somebody who you care about and you're just like, tell me about it. I want to understand your perspective. I want to understand your experience. I want you to know I'm here. I care about you. Right? It doesn't matter whether we think the same, believe the same, view things the same. There is still an ability for us to be in this co-creative experience and for us to be engaging in that type of relationship with one another. And I feel like that is one of the roots that is being desired here above any other of the like physical, tangible things. We're going to talk about those in a second. Not that those things don't matter, right? One of the things I'm also passionate about is looking at like the human side of things and the spiritual, energetic, intangible side of things, and acknowledging both the importance of both of those and how to go about doing things. Okay? So when you're seeing somebody who is speaking up or sharing something, if you have a tendency to go to that space of, oh, they just don't understand, oh, they just don't, whatever, really, curiosity is such a powerful tool, right? Getting curious about that and viewing it again is like, I have something of value and importance to this conversation. They have something of value and importance in this conversation. And us acknowledging that in both cases, rather than sometimes on the flip side, it goes back to, oh, they just don't see, they just don't understand, they haven't figured this out. I used to be like them, I'm not like them anymore. If they were like me, they would see and feel and think the same way I do, right? That's not so much the point about trying to get one or the other to our side. Okay? In fact, in energetics, there is a principle, what I call polarity, that is absolutely fundamental and critical to change occurring and avoiding stagnation. And that is like a separation of charge. So if you think back to some of your science classes, right, like positive and negative charge, I'm not going to do an exact parallel to like physical energy or and like intangible, spiritual, energetic energy here. But I just want you to think about it as in like even your cells and the way that they regulate how much water and waste and different things goes between them. When we look at like how even signals are sent along your neurons, right? A lot of this is regulated by charge gradation. So when you have a larger charge in one area and a smaller charge in somewhere, it causes a shift. And it's that movement from high charge to lower charge that causes that, or it's that separation in charge that causes that, right? If you have equal amounts in the two different spaces, there's no movement, right? Molecules aren't changing where they are in location. Similar kind of concept in energetics. When we have the separation of charge, it creates the momentum that helps propel things forward. And why this is so important, because it will help you start being able, or at least it helps me, right? I'll speak for myself here. Why it's so important for me is because it can help you recognize the value of both parts, right? That there are people who are being called to be in this charge, and there are people who are being called to stay in this charge. And we need both because that is what creates that momentum for it to occur. Okay. Now, when we zoom in and we're focusing on the human part, which is what we normally do, we're used to that. It's familiar. It's right there in front of us, right? It's engaging. It's very easy to just see the differences or see the conflict, right? And I really want to challenge the perception that there was any conflict or controversy occurring in any of these things that took place over this weekend. When we view something as a conflict, it's a problem. It's, and again, some of you are going to be sitting here being like, but it is a problem, Emily. I know, hang on. That's what I'm saying, right? We naturally, I guess, pit ourselves into a space that is more, what's the word I want to say? Like it needs to be overcome in some way. Whereas if we can instead view this weekend as an opportunity of a conversation, an opportunity of collaboration, an opportunity of even just contrast. Right? Contrast is a word I use in my coaching all the time because one of the things that I'm passionate about and that I love applying in my own life and helping my clients understand is contrast is a necessary part of life. Contrast is what provides clarity. Contrast is all about gathering information, about gathering data. It is an important part of life. And we have a tendency to judge or downplay or dismiss or not want to engage with conflict. And there's particularly a religious history around that, right? Of, well, we need to be peacemakers and we need to be kind and we need to whatever. But there's also this religious vigor in there of we need to defend for what's right and we need to stand up for it. We need to follow the convictions of our hearts. And when you see that basic fundamental piece, if you have a background related to the LDS Church in any way, right? It doesn't matter where you are or how you consider yourself, what you believe, what you practice, any of that now. If you have a background, those elements are going to be a part of you. So they're showing up in this side of the conversation and they're showing up in this side of the conversation. Everyone is wanting to try and find peaceful solutions. And a big part of it is there's a feeling of like, we don't know what that is or what that looks like or how to go about having this conversation. And a part of this is a parallel that I would draw to when I'm working with relationships or even relationships like my own spousal one. There are times where we're entering a new level of growth where we become new people and it's almost like starting over in a way. Like I've had to spend some time getting to know myself. He's had to spend some time getting to know himself. We have to rediscover what our relation looks like together. How do we interact with one another? How do we talk with each other? How do we work about things? And it's an entirely new experience, right? We're in essence going through an organizational level version of this right now, where there's this shift in how are we interacting with one another? How are we engaging with each other? And when we again, view this as a problem and we're trying to hold on to or fit another person into a perspective or belief that we feel like they should be in, right? Which again, tendency, I've had this experience in my own relationship where I'm like, but wait, I'm so used to you acting like this, or I want you to be in this way, right? We have this opportunity for something new, but it needs to look like this, right? Rather than rediscovering that together. And so that's one of the pieces that for me, I'm really wanting to focus on is this idea that we have this beautiful opportunity that came to light here and has been coming to light more and more over the past several years in particular, as there's been sort of this building of momentum. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. But around this idea of how do we want to interact with one another? How do we want to engage with each other? And a key fundamental part of that is learning how to see each viewpoint, each perspective as a part of things. And instead of focusing on, we got to get everybody over here, or we got to get everybody over here, this person has it figured out, these people have it figured out, right? And you can find evidence to support both ways. Okay? Whichever one you focus on the most, you're going to build the most momentum around that. You're probably going to feel the strongest about that, right? The goal is not to stay in this playing field. The goal is that this momentum between the two actually pulls us up into a third experience. Okay? In energetics, sometimes we call that another dimension. Okay? We're no longer playing here on just the x-axis, we're starting to move up the y-axis. Okay? And that moving up the y-axis, to clarify, because there are some of you who are my spiritual junkies with me, right? Who may be sitting here like, yes, a higher perspective, a more inspired one, a awakened and ascending perspective. That's not what I'm talking about here, okay? What I'm talking about here is in the relationship dynamic when you have two parties. Those two parties exist for the sake of helping direct to something new that emerges beyond it. I know it's my little 2-year-old saying, hey, Mom. Dad's on charge of kids today, though, so eventually he'll get the message. And so it's this new process where in our human experience, we're very used to working in this plane to try and create change, to try and solve problems, to try and solve solutions. And that's where we get this, like, we pull things this way, and then they get pulled back this way, and then we pull things this way, and then they get pulled back this way. And there's, a couple different perspectives we can take on that. One is like, that's part of the point to help us grow and meander. It's like, we're going this way together, right? So we need both parties helping to do that. But there's another perspective of taking these pieces and This is a study theory U. MIT's Presencing Institute teaches this whole system. Can't remember his last name now, the guy who created it. But it is so wonderful and beautiful in discussing this idea that when you're creating solutions that enter into this higher state here, you are emerging beyond the conflict, which is another piece that I want to highlight and emphasize, I guess, because as much as I think it is important, some of these like physical, tangible things that people are talking about and highlighting, and you can have your own thoughts and opinions on them, whether it's, in regards to, I saw things like voting more women in church, allowing women to sit on the stands, or the Relief Society to sit on the stand, Relief Society president, so she can like have a better view of what's going on in the ward and see people and what's connecting, right? To like, what were some of the other ones? Right. And a lot of people were like, these are very basic, mundane. You don't have to change the handbook. You don't have to make big changes. Like, just give some breadcrumbs for women wanting and being like, yes, we care about you. Right? And here's where I'm going to play with that idea a little bit, because from my perspective and my opinion, right, the fact that so many women are saying these things matter, these things are important, right, means there's something to that, right? And I've had beautiful experiences with them, beautiful experiences of my own, of seeing this journey and this space that many are feeling called to. I'm also seeing so many in this space feeling called to hold this. We talked about that already, though, right? So there's a need for these new things. I think there's a beautiful opportunity, again, of like looking at the relationship and saying, we're ready for the next level of our relationship. What does that look like? Right? When me and my husband were navigating some things, it was really, really easy to get caught up in the perspective of like, this is a problem, 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 this needs to change, this needs to change, this needs to change, this needs to change, right? And there were very valid reasons for every single one of those things. If I was, talking to my girlfriend, talking to anyone, sharing like, these are the problems we're going through, these are like the challenges, most people would be like, yes, those are things that need to change. Like, those are problems, okay? And yet it became so overwhelming for both of us to try and sit there and be like, here's the relationship we have now. We've gained an awareness through a lot of contrast and lived experience that these are all the problems, right? And a lot of those problems came from just realizing and recognizing and getting clear on what is it I want, right? I want this in my life. I want more of this in my life. I want more of this in my life, right? But usually that clarity came through the form of, I hate this. I don't like this. I was really hurt by this. This continues to really hurt me. I have problems with this. I struggle with this. This has had this negative repercussion, right? We learn through the contrast. And so we see it from this, like, these are all the things that are hurting me. Right? And we went through a period of really, really hurting. Like, there's just no other way to put that, right? And it reached a point where it was like, we've got to do something differently in how we're thinking about this, how we're framing this, how we're going about this, because it's not sustainable, right? For me to come to a list with my husband and be like, this is everything that you need to do differently or else I'm done, right? That's like massively overwhelming. Like, oh my gosh, I care about this thing. Like, I don't know how to do all those things. I don't know how to implement it. I still need to learn. I don't even know what that means. Like, I don't know, but I care about you and I want to do something and I don't know how. Like, that's really overwhelming on that side, right? And it's really overwhelming on the other side to be like, how do I bring all these things up? How do I hold on to all these? How do I like stay in the relationship as I'm struggling with all of these things that are going on here, right? That sort of dynamic, and in our case, it kind of went both ways too, is really hard. It just strains relationships. And yet that's the way we're most used to trying to solve problems and be in relationships and figure out things. A few perspective shifts that we made changed everything. And a lot of those I think are applicable to this situation here. Okay? And the first one was, instead of viewing it as these are all of the problems that have to change, you started viewing it as these are all of the ways our relationship gets to expand and blossom and grow. Okay? Now I know there are those of you who are going to be sitting here being like, that's a lovely perspective, but in your relationship with your spouse, you both get to decide and discuss things and figure out what's going on and how you want to move forward. There are very real limitations here, like of changes that we cannot make as women, that we cannot do. So that's just like a pipe dream to think about, oh, look at all the wonderful things here. And quite frankly, it just hurts to think about, oh, this is all the potential that we have, and to feel like you have no power to do anything about it and nothing you can express or say or do to help step into that relationship. And that when you try, you are looked down upon, you are called out, you are whatever, all these different negative experiences. Like, I get that. Okay? I so get that. Which, again, we're going to talk about some of the energetics, because I think that adds another element in here to understand this process and what needs to happen and what needs to be occurring. Because everything in our life experience has a physical, tangible component to it, or a human element, and has a intangible, energetic, spiritual component to it. And recognizing both of these components are there when they're showing up, how they're interacting with each other, what are the rules of engagements, I guess, between them, that shifts some of that perspective. So here's a few of those that I want to share with you. One is these human like desires. Can we just make these simple changes for women, right? There's the perspective from the women who are designing these changes of like, this would feed so much in establishing a sense of trust of like, I'm not just saying I am listening, I hear you, I value you. I'm actually taking in that feedback, and I'm showing forth some tangible thing to let you know, yes, I care about this. I care about you. This is important to me too, right? And for a lot of women, it feels like they're asking for nothing in a lot of these very seemingly basic perspectives. Okay? On the other hand, there's those who sit there and go, well, you shouldn't need to have those sorts of things. You should be able to just feel your own sense of empowerment, of value, of being seen, being heard, okay? Which I think a lot of women here have. And it's not that they're necessarily missing that. It's that they're saying, I'd love for this relationship to enter a new level. Here's some of the ways, and here's a key element in this, in the linguistics of masculine and feminine energy. There's a whole other thing that I teach around masculine and feminine language. So fascinating, so interesting. But part of the reason it matters is because you need to be in the right energy for the other party to be able to move forward. In any relationship, somebody's in the masculine role, somebody's in the feminine role. When I say masculine and feminine, I'm not necessarily talking about personality, sexuality, gender, anything like that, right? They are two different states, sort of like positive and negative charge, right? They have different qualities to them, and different ways that they interact with one another. And so one of the things that is really important is to be able to recognize which state you're in and how to stay in that correct energy state, which is going to be important about something I'm going to be talking about here in a sec, about what I think is going on energetically right now and what that means for things moving forward and for progress happening. Because we have this tendency to have this journey where it's like, there's so many layers here. I'm like, there's so much information I want to teach you in order to have this one conversation. And so I'm trying to figure out what's the simplest way that I can make the points I want to make. Okay. One of the key things is if The feminine is in masculine energy. She actually blocks the masculine from being able to show up, right? So we're looking again at an energetic level here, but this impacts how things play out on the physical level. So, simple example, when you come in and you say, you have to do this, I need this thing needs to change, here's all the reasons why. That can all be 100% true. We are not invalidating that at all. Okay. You can have wonderful reasons, things that you need, things that are going on, but that is for the feminine's own experience of getting clear on understanding that. When she brings it into the relationship dynamic, her job is to say, this is the way I would like to be supported. Okay. And it's, again, really hard when you have this big long history, this big long list, and lots of momentum around here are all the ways that I have been prevented from something, whatever that is, right? Or I have been blocked, or I have been hurt, right? Everything from just your own experience to very literal, real inappropriate behaviors occurred, right? Everywhere in between in that spectrum, right? Learning how to recognize those experiences, validate the emotions and perspectives of those experiences, process through those experiences, and then step into the relationship, that's a big skill. And what we're often wanting to jump to, and again, this plays out in regular relationship dynamics as well, is we want to jump to the relationship experience where we can be in conflict together securely with one another and stay connected. But most people don't go from, oh, there's conflict, I'm separating, I'm blaming, I'm whatever, to that state in one jump. Right? There's a process and a pattern of how we get there. And one of those pieces is practicing, okay, I'm going to take my experience, my things here. I'm going to have this, my experience here. Then I'm going to come back into the relationship from a more grounded, centered space, being able to say, hey, I'm going to share a lot of these things. I'm going to voice these things. And again, this is not any judgment of saying like the people who are commenting or sharing or doing one action or another were or weren't doing these things, right? The point is just to bring an awareness and a highlight for yourself as you're thinking about these things, as you're engaging with these things. In what ways can I, like, what is the experience I'm looking for here, right? Sometimes the experience we're looking for is that solidarity, right? Of other people who are sitting here like, oh my gosh, this is so hard, I'm struggling so much. Or even people over here who are like, oh my gosh, I don't understand why all this is happening. Like, this should not be going on. Like, we have to try harder, like whatever that is. Solidarity in that experience, that is important. That is vital. That's a part of our processing. It's a part of our nervous system regulation. It's an integral piece because when we have that space, it allows us to not bring that into the relationship dynamic as much because we've had a place where we can vent, where we can process, where we can do things. So I love seeing that there are spaces and conversations and experiences where people are having those ones. And I think where some of the confusion comes into play is when we get together, we then are trying to recreate that same experience, right, in the relationship one. And that's not the purpose, and that's not the point of the relationship one, right? Not yet. Anyways, eventually we can learn how to get into that space. But before we do that, we have to, again, move into that space where we're emerging beyond, right? And now we're saying, okay, I've had lots of contrast. I've gotten lots of clarity on the things I do want and the things I don't want, and how I want to, what are the things that are important to me that I want to bring into this conversation with the relationship component here, right? And then when we're in that space, that's where we can start having some of the discussions. And that's a big part of what I saw take place here, right? Is regardless of what the thing was, whether it was the post, whether it was talking about the devotional, whether it was discussing the Salt Lake Tribune article, is there was conversation that was coming up, conversation that was being discussed of like, oh, these things are important to me. Right? And focusing on that perspective of like, oh, I have clarity on this, clarity of this thing that is important to me. And then being able to validate and go, and these things are important to other people, and they have clarity on that thing. That's a beautiful space to be in, right? And it's part of how we can start navigating that on the individual level. Okay. Now, individual level. A lot of people have done lots of work on that, more familiar. You might be sitting here like, great, yes, I feel okay in that. That's not my issue. My issue is there's no change actually happening, okay? Which is one of the places the energetics, again, gets really fun in some of the patterns that I think are playing out here and some of the direction that I see things potentially taking. How that plays out physically, we'll have to see. But that's where I want to share with you one of these models. Okay. So this is a staircase model I created for those of you who've never seen it before. Welcome. It's a wonderful thing. I talk about it all the time. It's such a useful tool because it describes the pattern of growth, which is how we move forward, and expansion, which is moving upwards, right? So it's kind of like a graph. You read it this way. And the tan or the gold represents one strand. The other strand is this blue silver. And when you have a full version of it, I had to color in some of the pieces here. I need to print out a new one, but it's sort of like two ribbons that intertwine with each other. Right? See how they sort of go back and forth. And the reason I call it the staircase model is because it's like you're climbing stairs. Right? So I stick a figure person, my fingers, right? Going up the stairs. So we go through many rounds. This actually represents a full, complete cycle. And part of, well, actually, this is my really big one. So it has two complete cycles. The reason you can tell is each one of these strands, the orange or the blue, represents the masculine or the feminine party in the relationship. And so you see the feminine goes through an expansion and the masculine goes through an expansion. That's the completion of one cycle. So they've done that. So you go through this twice here. Okay. So that imagery of that repetition, we go through this also, it's layered, or I call it fractal nature. So if anyone's familiar with fractals, it's like a pattern that repeats over and over. It's kind of one way you can sort of think about it is Russian nesting dolls, right? So the different dolls. So what I'm going to be describing here, you may see play out in like your own individual life. It's played out on smaller levels in the like church woman relationship. If you've watched any of my lives in the past, I've talked a bit about Elder Renlund's talks and how they mark these patterns actually throughout General Conference. And we saw him sort of highlighting these different pieces as we were moving through it. So we'll get to that in a sec. But yeah, that's also in some separate videos. But the point being, it plays out on multiple layers and we have this bigger layer that's coming out. Okay? So ideally, we want this interdependency in relationship, right? But interdependency is not always what happens because one, we're often not aware that this is what's going on and we're humans. So we have some other natural tendencies that start to show up. And one of these is a natural tendency of masculine energy and a natural tendency of feminine energy. And what's really beautiful about these two is they're designed to sort of interact and balance each other when they're in the intertwined version. Okay? So if you have masculine energy that is left to itself, okay, it naturally has sort of this like downward movement to it. So you look at it here, right? It's going here and it like goes down, right? It goes from this side. I call this a flip, but it's like that downward movement. Where feminine energy, it naturally starts with this upward movement. And that's going to be important for understanding two important concepts here. One of them we are very familiar with in our modern day world, especially in the last few years. It's gained a lot of awareness and discussion, and that's the hyper masculine experience. The other, though, we are not as familiar with, and it's actually really, really important to understand, which is hyper feminine energy, because both of them are very damaging, very destructive, but we have a tendency to sometimes over condemn hypermasculine energy, and that's not dismissing the reality of the unhealthiness in either of these natures and the way that it can really cause real hurt and damage. Okay, I don't want that to be misunderstood here, right? But the reason I say we vilify it sometimes is because it's very physical, it's very tangible, it's usually more concrete, it's easier to see, it's easier to just like point out and have everyone agree, like, that's wrong, that's bad. Whereas hyper feminine energy actually is often very difficult to identify, to recognize, or to see. And it often looks like it's very virtuous and good and is taking the higher route. Right? And yet, hyper masculine energy, it leads to control and constriction. Right? Hyper feminine energy actually leads to death and destruction. Right? So we have the like constricting into an unhealthy dynamic where it's like even to the level of abuse or tyranny, right? Where you are so constricted in, whereas feminine energy goes the opposite. It can become so disconnected, actually causes separation, death, and chaos. And the reason why this is really important is because, again, when we're trying to navigate change and we're trying to figure out what is the next way forward, each side is going to feel a need to pull the other one in a certain direction. And with that, the other side is going to want to resist that in order to avoid the hyperexpression of either. Okay? So I'm going to show you the hyperexpression of too much masculine energy first, what that looks like here. So instead of the masculine energy flipping and moving into this space here, where it's now supporting the growth of the feminine, a rise into something new, right? That's what the masculine is meant to do as the feminine is moving into this dynamic. And later, the feminine returns the favor for the masculine, which is another important piece to note, is that it is specifically designed that we don't go through growth in the same way at the same time. Because energetically, we have to be in different spaces to be able to support one another moving into different areas. So part of what's so valuable is being able to learn. Each one of these lines here is basically just separating out a different segment of the process. And when you have learned to recognize, oh, I'm in this segment versus I'm in this segment, how the relationship looks, what you do to help it move forward and to progress is different. And this line here is particularly important. It's what I call a polarity line. And that matters because what was working before, once you cross this line, no longer works. It will keep you stuck. You are supposed to enter into a new pattern and a new way of being. So again, this is sort of acting like a roadmap to help us understand, how do we move through change? How do we do it in a way that we're making it easier and healthier for both parties? Now, most of the time when we're having discussions around topics like the church and membership and leadership, it's often taking like a psychological perspective, right? Looking at the mental or emotional health. Great value in that. Good dynamic in place to have. Important part of the conversation. This is another important part of the conversation, though, because it's not as simple as, well, these things support this type of healthy relationship. The timing also matters and also plays a key part. If you're trying to do something that you're not in that stage for, it can actually slow things down, halt progress, make things more difficult. It experiences more pain, more frustration, right? So understanding these different phases and dynamics is so helpful and so valuable, because you'll We go through this pattern all the time. All of us are going through it continually throughout our lives on so many different levels. That's something we break down more when I'm working with clients and different things, but we don't even realize it most of the time. And so it's a lot bumpier than it sometimes needs to be. But the better you get at recognizing it and how to move through the different stages, the easier it gets. So going back to our example, masculine energy is supposed to flip. It's supposed to move into the space to support the feminine rise, which is something we see going on right now, right? There's this big surge of the feminine being like, we are ready. We are wanting to do more things. We are craving more of this experience. And it's that flip of the masculine moving into that space, right? Now, again, that downward energy, though, has a tendency to, when you have too much masculine energy, to level out, to keep things flat in the space. And what can happen when that occurs is it's like blocking that feminine energy, right? And so it makes it really difficult for this rise to happen. So you'll see I have like the faint outline of what the rise would be if that took place, but that masculine energy comes in and it's just like blocking it. So I call this a pimple because it looks like a pimple, a little blemish that you pop. But that's what commonly happens with a feminine, right? It's like, oh, I'm going to try this thing, and now I can't. And I'm going to try this thing, I can't. And so when we look back at history, there's, again, a couple of different perspectives we can take from an energetic viewpoint. One of them being there's been different waves of this, right? This is not the first time this has happened in the Mormon LDS experience. There's been multiple waves of this occurring. And you can view that, which we're going to talk about in a second here, as sort of like contractions building and growing stronger in order to progress the labor and help it move to delivery, which is a new relationship dynamic, right? But you can also view some of those as like these pimpling experiences where it's like, we tried it and I didn't. We tried it and we didn't. And this is where it can get so draining and frustrating, particularly for the feminine, and in fact, traumatizing is what tends to happen here. Because what happens is repeatedly, the energy is going to be pulling you to try and rise again, even after a pimple has occurred. But when you come approaching that space again, there's like this remembrance stored in the body of the last time you were in that space and what happened and what did that feel like. And so it's very easy to get into a space where it's like, it's not safe to do this. It's not safe to rise. It's not safe to move in the direction that is energetically healthy here. Right? And that's not even looking at, well, how do I do that, right? How am I supposed to do that when there's this masculine block here and I can't get past it and I can't get through it? We'll talk about that maybe in a second. But the thing that I want to point out first is if this pimple happens, what it naturally leads to is enmeshment, which is this space right here, an energetic enmeshment. And that's where there's sort of a blending of identities that occurs. And you'll see there's still a little bit of a separation between like the masculine is more up here, the feminine is more down here, but they're really blending together. They're not in the same defined, distinct way that they're supposed to be when they're moving through this interdependent relationship, right? From a psychological standpoint, we would say it's important for each individual to be self-identified, right? To have their own identity, and you're learning how to create a relationship that's interdependent with one another, right? So this could be a visual representation of codependency in some way, right? That's just one parallel. But when we're talking about it here, the important part of this is the identities are mixed, okay? And so threatening one identity threatens the other. And it's like, you need to stay in this enmeshed state in order to feel safe. And when we add nervous system regulation into this, this is where it gets really interesting and fascinating, because this enmeshed state feels safe. And it has still with it components of the healthy state that are there, right? So it becomes really easy to say, well, this is healthy. Another way of describing this and looking at it, hang on, I didn't erase my whiteboard. I want to draw you this picture because for the thing I'm going to describe here in a sec, I think this is going to be really important. We're going to pull in some historical context and again, paint a picture of like what's been going on here, why this is so big, right? Some of you are probably feeling a little bit of like, there was something big that was happening this weekend. I can't quite articulate what. I'm a little nervous to think that, maybe nothing's going to come from this, right? And I want to give you a bigger, broader perspective of what's going on because that's another key piece of this is an organization is a very big energy system. So we talk a lot about like, it takes forever for change to happen in the church. You'll hear people say that. And that's in part because it's a bigger layer of an energy system. An individual taking change still takes time, but it's faster than a couple making change. And a couple making change is faster than a family making change. And a family making change is faster than a community making change, right? And we're at that community level there. So just from an energetic perspective, there's a lot more connections and things that have to happen and have to get into that right orientation for things to flow the way that they're meant to. Side little tangent there. But anyways, back to our enmeshment thing. Okay, so use my orange and blue again here. Another way of looking at enmeshment, and this is kind of fun. Those of you who took your biology classes, I always get comments about this. Is like, it's like DNA. I'm like, yes, it is, right? So we're meant to have, wait, I did this wrong. In any individual energy system, they're supposed to be their own masculine and feminine counterparts. Okay, so I, as an individual, I have masculine and I have feminine energy. Now, one of the key things is every individual also has like a container, is the way I like to think about it, around your masculine or masculine and feminine energy. It's not just that, oh, everybody has both, and so we can all interact and we can all do whatever. This core polarity is actually really, really important for when we're in a relationship because it helps define, like, in the overall casing, are you in the masculine role or are you in the feminine role, right? For that relationship. And that matters because it's like an atom, right? And I'm not going to do this correctly because I haven't thought through the analogy and I'm doing it on the top of my head. So if I get all my chemistry wrong, please ignore it. Just pretend this is my analogy. I'm trying to pull one up. But the overall charge of that atom, right, could be positive or negative, right? Sodium positive, chlorine negative, right? Inside that atom, though, are smaller particles that make it up, and they have their own unique combination of charges, right? Those have to do with different things than the overall charge, but that overall charge determines some of the interactions that it has with other elements, right? A sodium charge would not be a sodium if certain things were different about it, right? Even though it still is going to have, even if we have to go to like a deeper than our protons and neutrons and we start looking at like quarks and muons and different things like that. Muons? Made that one up. Can't think of the word right now. My husband would be like, oh, you know these, we've been over it. But anyways, smaller particles, right? There's charges in that and the way that they interact with one another. And again, why that matters so much and why I'm so passionate about that is because if your core polarity is off, your ability to create things energetically, oh, so limited. There's always gonna feel like something is just like, nah, not quite there. So whole separate thing. I love helping people understand like, what is that? What does that look like? What does that mean? So anyways, that's like kind of visual here. But the point for getting back to our conversation about the church is on the outside, right? We're supposed to have our own masculine and feminine piece. But sometimes, there's various reasons, this doesn't happen. And so what occurs instead is one party takes on one part of the relationship and the other party takes on the other. And we're talking energetically here, okay? We're gonna expand this more practical in a second. But what that ends up being is in the relationship, instead of having basically like two healthy, fully developed individuals who are in relationship with one another, you have two half people who are in relationship with each other, and they're sort of like fulfilling part of the roles. Personally, from an energetic perspective, when we had the separation of the Community of Christ Church from the main branch of the LDS Church, that to me was where this breaking of, again, the overall feminine and the overall masculine sort of broke and separated. Okay? And in that state, in order to preserve what was there, we had to move into this dynamic. Okay? There's a lot of like survival stuff that happened during this time period, right? This is when Brigham Young is first taking over, and it's like, people are just trying to kill us, right? Like, we just gotta get somewhere safe where we can stay alive. Like, focus was very much on like, we just need to survive. So this is a survival mechanism to say that a thing stays alive, that it doesn't fully dissolve or fall apart here. Right? So when this happens, though, eventually there reaches a point where in order to return to the really healthiest version, this relationship dynamic has to break in order to make room for the other pieces to come back in. And I wrote on my Patreon, Emily, patreon.com/Emily Karen Baker. You can go read the article if you want. When the church purchased the Kirtland Temple and a lot of other things from the Community of Christ, that to me was an energetic marker or symbol of bringing back in some of the feminine, right? Like, that thing that was lost is now being brought back into this experience here. Okay? But part of what still needs to either occur is that breaking apart of the enmeshment, which I think will actually highlight a little bit better here in what that looks like. And this has kind of been going on for a while over the last couple of years in various growing amounts. But basically, there has to be, a re-establishment of the two different parts, like of the separation between the masculine and the feminine, right? This line has to be reestablished, right? To break out of this enmeshment. So everything that was going on over this weekend from an energetic perspective was really helping give some clarity and some momentum around this. You had this like condensing of the feminine coming together, which is sort of that consolidation that's occurring here. Right? Which again, and it kind of talked about this at the beginning, but that's another reason why I view it so important of being able to bring women with an LDS background, wherever your perspective or experience is, into some unifying bit. It can't just be there's the progressive and the Orthodox women and like the progressive church membership and leadership versus Orthodox church membership and leadership. That's going to keep us in the wrong state. We have to get women in a centered, unified space, and that allows space for leadership to get into unified, centered space so that we can break out of this pattern here. So you see that we saw evidence of that occurring, of this like coming together of the feminine more in this conversation experience. And that's part of reestablishing that line. Now, one of the things that I think is going to be important 4 things moving forward and when this happens and how this all happens is a lot of the conversation dialogue I see is really focused on, dear church, women are hurting. Please make these changes to give them a little comfort as they're trying to deal with everything and to feel like you see them and you hear them, right? To me, there's a bigger piece to this, right? And it's a part of this breaking out perspective of this redefining the other half. And a part of that for me is it's not just about women want equal representation and we want to be able to do the same thing that men are able to do. To me, if we had that perspective and it was solely coming from the argument of like, well, that's how the rest of the world is doing things and we should do this and we should whatever, that would not be a good reason in my mind. And you're welcome to disagree. Not that I don't think those things are important, right? But I always come from an energetic, spiritual place first. So saying that, well, we're just going to do this because other human beings are doing this, that's not a good reason. I don't do anything in my life just because other human beings are doing it, right? And so from a church perspective, if I were in leadership, I would agree and I would understand leadership saying like, no, we're not going to do things just because that's what other people are doing. And there's a valid energetic reason for this too, which is we have to learn to navigate this like intertwined perspective with each other, because if we don't, the result is either this enmeshment, which we just talked about, or we have to be careful on the flip side. If we get hyper feminine, it can lead to destruction, right? So there's this like fine balance of breaking out of any hyper masculine energy experience that we have and sort of pulling away from that and not getting so far off that it leads into a destruction space. So both perspectives and viewpoints have some validity in that, and that's part of the role of the masculine and the feminine. The role of the feminine is she gets triggered to rise when the masculine energy starts getting too strong to sort of help keep it balanced from falling into that enmeshed state. She's supposed to come online to help reestablish that balance. Meanwhile, the masculine gets triggered if the feminine starts leaning too far into a feminine space to help bring it back into the centered space. And this is another reason why learning to look at how change happens and how it occurs through a cooperative, progress-oriented perspective is so important because it minimizes the trauma experience. Trauma and nervous system is so critical to how we move through this process, because we have past patterns and some of these are generational that we inherit, I mean, if I can speak right, that say, oh, when the feminine is pushing back, that's dangerous, even though it's this and it's healthy, it's supposed to be occurring, it's natural, it's necessary even to maintain the health of a system, right? But if our body and our nervous system remembers this experience of like the feminine pushing into hyper feminine experience, it may associate that healthy experience with an unhealthy one, right? Conversely, if feminine is used to too much of the masculine energy coming down, she becomes aware of that, experiences it, whatever way, that can wire her nervous system to perceive when the masculine energy, when we're over here, and the masculine energy is doing its job and is trying to help us stay in the centered space, as oppression, as that control moving back into this dynamic. And it's a really interesting process to learn to rewire your nervous system to not get triggered by those healthy experiences and to learn to recognize the difference between them. And it's a part of reestablishing trust after you've been in a dynamic, in a relationship that was what I call balanced, right? So there was a rhythm, it was working, it was playing out in some piece, but it ultimately wasn't a fully healthy expression. That's this here, right? There's balance here in that we have a masculine and feminine, and we can kind of continue moving through this interdependent relationship there, but we're missing half of both, right? The other half of the feminine is missing, and the other half of the masculine is missing. And this is, again, an important part we'll get to in a sec, but you have to learn to recognize, okay, we've been going through this relationship. And when you start moving towards a healthier one, it can feel like chaos, right? Like we are all over the place in what is happening and what's going on. And it's because you're adjusting to a new rhythm, right? But everything sort of gets shaken up and disoriented from all of that, right? So it's helpful to have these markers, these patterns, these tools, these processes, so that you're not just navigating like, okay, what's mentally and emotionally healthy for me to be doing, what's healthy in relationship, but to actually understand like the energetic component here of what's at play, right? Because when you're in that space and it's like getting all disorienting, it's because that other half of the equation is there. And this is to me where it gets super, super fascinating. Because right now, the women's organization, the Relief Society, I think has actually a big part of its masculine leg here. And it's missing the feminine leg. Wrong color. It's missing the feminine leg. Okay. Meanwhile, the male part of the church experience here has its feminine leg, actually, and is missing its masculine leg. What that feminine leg is its spiritual identity. Okay. It has a sense of spiritual understanding, of spiritual development, of spiritual maturation, right? I have a whole theory of proper spiritual development. We usually talk about just like James Fowler's stages of faith and how our faith matures, right? Faith maturing is only one part of the process. There's also spiritual development that occurs and spiritual evolution. Whole other tangent we'll go on, we won't go into today. But the point being, the male experience in the church has a really established that spiritual identity. And what is actually being craved in a lot of ways from a lot of members who are struggling is more of that masculine leg. That masculine leg could look like things like related to finances and how is the church using and spending money, or different responsible things. If you look at some of the biggest scandals that have happened in the last couple of years, there's been one around like the use of the church's financial funds and in regards to like abuse and leadership and reporting and things like that. If you take this down from like an organizational level to like a relationship level, that is yes, quick answer. Replay will be available. It will be on my Instagram. I'm also doing this live on YouTube. So if you want to share this, if you want to go back through, I'll probably go back through and timestamp some of it too. So if you just want to hit certain points or share certain points, I'll have that in the comments on the YouTube. Both of those are Emily Carolyn Baker. So you can find those. YouTube channel is also linked in my bio. So feel free. This is like a long one, but there's a lot of things I wanted to cover here. So anyways, when you're looking at this from like a small relationship thing, right? That's basically like, oh, not being responsible with personal finances, or not being responsible in like, you could say, what's the parallel of like the masculine energy, right? The masculine energy is basically underdeveloped. We see those common symptoms show up. And in fact, this shows up in anybody, right? If your personal masculine energy is underdeveloped, you're gonna have a harder time having a budget or saving or like having some of that fiscal responsibility there. It also can lead to again, having these like unhealthy dynamics that show up. So we're needing more of that like masculine component to come in. And we see this also sort of play out with again, like we get lots of spiritual messages, and yet it doesn't feel like there's any backing, right? That's what a lot of women are saying is like, and kind of why this whole Instagram post blew up in a lot of ways was a lot of women viewing it and feeling like it was saying women have this thing, but feeling like the physical, tangible backing was not there to support that, which is one of the arguments that I often look at with something like that is I do personally believe we have a lot of spiritual power that is given to women. But again, the ability to express that is missing because on the feminine side of things, and I found this super fascinating watching the devotional, most of what was being talked about and discussed in there in terms of relief was like physical, tangible things, right? So humanitarian aid, bringing meals to people, not that these things aren't important, right? And not to say that like the masculine isn't doing those things or hasn't created those things, right? It's saying the focus there though, and the thing that I feel like so many women are feeling starved for or craving, two ends of the same stick, right? Is craving deeper spiritual connection and understanding, or feeling like they're not getting enough of that, which is another version of craving it, right? So you might feel like I have lots and I want to go deeper and do more, or feel like I have like nothing and I just want something of that back, right? Or want to experience more of that. So there's this craving for the spiritual side of things, right? And it's that spiritual identity that is missing in the women's side of things. Like for me, if I was going to be celebrating the Relief Society, again, I'm throwing this out not to say like, I know better and this is what the church should be doing, or I'm trying to speak for the church or anything like that, right? I'm just throwing out like, what would this look like, or what are some perspectives or things we can understand from this? If I love so much of the message around women, you have spiritual gifts, you have spiritual power. And in fact, that's part of the dissonance I feel like a lot of women have, is this whole sort of journey cycle. Right here, this is what I call the divine departure. The feminine starts to go on this discovery of like, ooh, something new, which for a lot of people was President Nelson's talk several years back, inviting women to study the priesthood, right? And to learn more about it. That was the start of so much that has led into this rise. And so when we are going through this process, right, the dissonance that can sometimes show up of, I've been told and taught these things about my spiritual power, my spiritual capabilities, my spiritual whatever, but then feeling like that how to express that is not as discussed or not as highlighted and is not put as the center thing, right? Like my dream is to have a Relief Society where like, yes, absolutely, there's still beautiful charity work being done, there's still lots of wonderful physical, tangible relief and things that are occurring. That is valuable. That's really important, right? And that is something Christ-like. But I also would love a Relief Society that represents like the spiritual development and like highlights the importance of spiritual relief, right? Which, if you think about it right now, is a big part of what the mainstream church focuses on, is that like spiritual component. And this is what's important, and is why we hear a lot of those things coming back in of like the covenant path or following these different things, is it's very focused on like the spiritual development side of things. And it's missing though that counterpart on the feminine. And again, I say the masculine has its spiritual identity, it has not fully stepped into the full expression of its masculine identity, in my opinion. When I look and see the structure of the church, the organization of it, the potential that it has to be an example in the world of what it is to be an organization who is operating at a higher level, right? That's not operating in a human space as much. For those of you who are familiar with the idea of like a spiritual awakening or ascension for an individual, having like a divine purpose or role that you're playing, I see part of the role of the LDS Church is to help teach us what could an organization look like that actually follows these fundamental principles. And right now we have all these different spaces that are picking them up, that are learning, that are practicing them. And it's like, are you going to step into the fullness of that potential? Because in my perspective, the core tenets of our doctrine have them there. And whenever I go out and I'm learning something, whether it's from my biology classes, my systems and leadership classes, energetics, I go, oh, that's the gospel, that's the gospel, that's the gospel, that's the gospel, right? And it's like, we just haven't fully embraced, like, this is who we are as a church organization. We're going to really go, the phrase the church loves to use, all in on that, right? It's still sort of halfway in holding on to this one perspective, in my view, right? And then on the flip side, the women component, and where I find it so interesting, Heavenly Mother comes into this part of the discussion so much, is the physical identity is in a lot of ways there, right? Which is why women can be like, I was serving, I was doing all these things, I was fulfilling all the roles, I was whatever. And then it was like, I just couldn't do it anymore. Because the thing that gives us fuel to show up in the masculine, in the physical, tangible thing, is the spiritual side of it. And so when there comes a point that there's not enough of that spiritual side momentum coming in to help support that, there's going to be burnout, there's going to be exhaustion. And that's what a lot of women go through. And they have to find that spiritual identity and nourishment and understanding of who they are somewhere else, which is where this perception can come in of, oh, you're just not being righteous enough, you're just not being spiritual enough, you're not doing these spiritual things, because in some way it's like we can sense it's a lack of spiritual something that's missing here, right? Either we're in an enmeshed experience, so we're not experiencing that personally yet in a lot of ways. That can be one place that it's coming from. There are individuals who have found that, who've reintegrated it, and on their personal level have both of those things. So they're still able to be there, because even though the whole system hasn't shifted, their system has, and they're able to maintain that and hold that in that space. Or they're seeing this again. We've been in this pattern as a big dynamic. We have one masculine leg and one feminine leg. And there's a perception of, oh, you just need to come back into the balanced version, instead of, oh, this is actually not the most aligned experience here, right? And why, to me, far more important than like the logistical, physical, tangible things the church could do, which I'm not saying they shouldn't do it. I'm not saying those wouldn't be helpful or even valuable, of just like reiterating, hey, hear you, we care about you, here's something, right? But I think on the flip side, looking from the church's perspective, there's a couple of different things that can come into play. One, well, it's not going to be enough. We're still going to get lashback of like, that's just a token thing. You can't just keep giving us token things. It's not enough, right? And also trying to recognize, like, being uncertain, what does this dynamic look like? Knowing that part of your job is to make sure that the feminine doesn't push too far out. So there's a very intrinsic, energetic part of you that is wanting to help hold things here, but still learning and trying to figure out what's the difference between this experience, right, where you're moving too much into the control, versus you're helping safeguard in a safe place. learning the difference between those two. That takes some time, and trying to figure out like, what does that mean and what does that look like, right? Because again, there's this piece of like, church, do these things, let us have this thing. And on the flip side, it's like, don't define things for us. We want to figure it out for ourselves. Women need to be the one doing it, right? And trying to, if you're in the masculine who doesn't have the full understanding or concept, right? I'm trying to be like, okay, how do I mesh these messages together? Like, how, okay, I don't, right? And it's just a space where I get empathy, right? And to me, that compassion is one of the key components of how we navigate through this, is that everyone on every level in every part of this is doing their best to navigate through things. And so instead of viewing all the different pieces that happened this weekend as like, we had this, and then this thing happened, and then this thing happened, and then maybe nothing happens, right? Afterwards, and it's like, well, it was all for nothing, right? It's so easy, even in our own lives. Like, I was literally talking to my friend this morning, like discussing with her how I saw an opportunity come up for things that my husband and I are wanting to work on to like shift it. And we weren't able to quite fully like make the shift happen. And I was quickly wanting to spiral back into a space of, this is never going to happen. I had fear, I had anxiety. Some of the old hurt was coming back of like, oh, what if we stay in this place? What if we don't progress? And I was able to like pause. And I have a whole bunch of tools because again, this is not something of like, momentum is a real thing here, I guess is what I want to say. You have to be kind to your body. You have to know how to work with your body, how to work with your mind, how to be able to shift these things. I've been practicing and training my mind, my body, my nervous system, my energy system too, all the different things to help me be able to make shifts easier and faster. And the shift that I was having to make here was one of saying, okay, pause for a sec, dropping into fear. Hi, fear. I see you. Thanks for showing up. Thanks for wanting to keep me safe. Thanks for helping me recognize something that's important to me and that I care about. And then I was able to slowly shift back into a perspective of this was progress. We needed to have awareness before we were ever going to move on to any of the other changes that needed to happen here. And so instead of looking at, again, well, we made this much progress and we still have all of this progress to go, like focusing here on what is missing, that is like the fastest way in any part of your life, in any relationship you have, whether it's like finishing a college degree or making it to bedtime or like whatever it is. If you're focusing on this part of it, you're setting yourself up for a more miserable experience. If you can learn to focus on, oh, this happened and this happened, oh, and this happened and this happened and this happened, you are wiring your brain and your body to be in that progress-oriented mindset. We talk a lot about growth-oriented mindset. Growth-oriented mindset is so important, but so is a progress. Because if you have a growth mindset without a progress mindset, oh, you can get so frustrated. Because it's like, I'm perpetually learning, I'm perpetually trying to see the best, but you're not seeing all the little steps of the progress that's happening and that's occurring and that's breaking down in this. But when you can look at a change you want to have happen, we can talk something small, right? Like, I just want to, we'll use an example here. I want to get my kid out the door 15 minutes earlier so that he's consistently showing up on time in the morning, right? To school. That's my goal, right? It seems like, well, that should be a really easy, simple thing. Like, just leave 15 minutes earlier. Okay, well, why am I not leaving 15 minutes earlier? Okay, well, what's behind that? If you actually break down the amount of steps that are involved in a small thing like that, right? It goes, okay, well, here are the tasks that need to get done in the morning. Here are, the other things that are often occurring in the morning, right? What is the best way to do this? And there's a few limiting agents here. Like in our house, a big one is a limited supply of hot water. The routine that works best for us is my kids take a bath first thing in the morning when they wake up. It's like a nice way to wake up. It's a way for them to like sort of relax and ease into the day. And it makes getting dressed and doing breakfast and getting out the door so much smoother, right? One part of the problem is I'm also wanting to shower while they're in the bathtub. And sometimes my husband's wanting to shower, but sometimes he's wanting to exercise earlier. So it's like, well, we need to get up earlier, but who's getting up earlier and who's doing what and who's in charge of what? Like there's so many pieces in it. And it would be almost simpler in a lot of ways if my husband and I were the one who was like, sorry, I have to leave at 7:30 to go to work. So I'm gone. And it's just on you to figure out how you want to get the kids to school on time, right? Because then it's just me and I can like figure it out a little bit better of how I'm going to do things. There's this beautiful thing though, of like both of us are here, both of us are wanting to support this morning routine and to show up and how we're wanting to do that. But we're having to co-create a morning experience together. And part of the piece is we're two different people with two different skills and two different abilities. And different days have different needs. And sometimes one of us got more sleep than the other, and one of us might be sick. Like there are so many variables that go into that, not to mention all the little habits and processes that need to occur, right? I'm really fast at unloading and loading the dishwasher and putting things away. So the amount of time that it takes for me to do that is small. I like to have the dishwasher unloaded so we can be loading it throughout the day so that it makes it easier to stay on top of dishes and they don't pile up as much. But that's something that it's like, I have lots of things I need to get done in the morning. My husband doesn't have as many, but it takes longer for him to unload the dishwasher. So there's not like an equivalent exchange there that's going on, right? So again, the point of all this is to just say, even in the smallest of things you want to change in your life, there's so many different variables that go into it. And most often we get caught up. This is a good reminder for me. I'm glad I used a practical example for myself. But we get caught up in trying to figure out and break down all the variables and figure out and like move them around of what's the best way and what's the best path and how should I be organizing and setting all of this up and what can we be doing here? And it's not to say that that's not important or doesn't play a role or doesn't contribute. However, focusing on all of that is not the most efficient way to go about creating change and creating goals. What is far more effective and far more efficient is instead of compensating for misaligned energy and misaligned state of being, which means you're doing a lot of the work more mentally and physically, right? Trying to solve things, trying to fix problems by, well, we could do this and we could do this, and what about doing this and what about doing that, and focusing mentally, right? You get the energy right. You work out the kink of it energetically, which we've been discussing all the different ways of working out the pieces energetically. It starts to just flow. And it's really fun and it's really cool when I do this with my coaching clients because I'll be like, okay, here's the thing that I want to change my life. Great, let's do that. And we're focusing on shifting all the energy patterns and all the limiting beliefs and getting them into the right orientation to be able to experience that thing they want. And if you look at it from the external, physical, tangible side of things, nothing's happening, 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 then boom. All of a sudden, like everything is different. And I'll check in with them 1 week and it's so fun because they'll be like, how's this week going? I'll be like, I don't know. It's been amazing. Somehow, like all these things are just getting done. This stuff that used to be hard, it's just occurring. It's just happening in this place. Right? And when it's on a smaller scale, like an individual goal we have, or a relationship, or a family part of things, it can be easier to see that process take place. And it's so fun and it's such a good reminder for me. And some of you are going to be saying here, like, I don't know what you're talking about. None of this makes sense. And no, that's okay. If you want to learn more, send me a DM. We'll talk about it. We'll clear up any questions you have. Put stuff in the comments. But if it's even you're just like, "Oh, I don't care," that's fine. It may not be your thing. But I can tell you how powerful it has been in my own life to realize whatever the human, physical, tangible thing is that's going on in my life, in my relationships, and the things I care about, as real and valid as that all is, it's a vehicle. And it's a vehicle for something else. And that vehicle is my own development, my own state of being. Who am I being? Who am I becoming? And when I can recognize that and I stop trying to fix here on the physical, tangible, and I just focus on being more and more consistent in who I am, in who I'm being, and I got to be careful how I say that, because I say in who I am, it's like, well, this is just who I am, and this is how I show up in the world, and this is what I'm doing. That's not even quite a piece of it, right? Because, and yet there's an important component to this, right? This is a big long thing we could go into. I mean, this is what I spend months teaching people and helping people on, right? We've talked about so many things here, but the point of this is to say, it's about changing you, not the human part of you. That comes secondary, because the key part of all of this is that we forget we're not just human beings, we're spiritual beings, right? Whatever you want to think about that, a spirit, a soul, a higher self, you want to think of premortal life, past life, whatever your view taker view is. So long as you can recognize there's some intrinsic conscious part of us that is more than the human part of who we are. There's that spiritual intrinsic part of us. That's who we really are. And we came here to get a body, as we like to say, or to have a life experience, to experience what it is to be human for the sake of our intrinsic growth and our intrinsic becoming and our intrinsic occurring. And when we can start taking that perspective of everything in our life, that the human piece comes second, it's an expression of who we are, or put another way, it's an expression of how much of who we are allowing ourselves to be. And I can tell you, until you experience some of this, it's not going to make sense. I could talk about it all day long. But when you have that experience where suddenly you're working on something, you're trying to become something, and you're not even necessarily like changing the physical things, but the relationship dynamic has changed because you've changed, it's the coolest thing ever. Because you're like, that just happened. How did that just happen? I didn't change like the physical, tangible things I was doing. And yet the physical, tangible things I'm experiencing are entirely different, right? It's a different way of approaching solutions. It's a different way of navigating conflict and relationship and learning how to resolve these sort of things. And it is one that I think we are ripe for. Like, I can't think of a better vehicle than religious organization and the relationship experiences in it to help highlight and remind us about the difference between the human part of our experience and the spiritual part of our experience, and how learning the importance of that spiritual part of the experience, how important it is, becomes the thing that transforms our human experience. And to me, that's a huge part about who Jesus Christ was. He was the perfect example and embodiment of that, of saying, I am a spiritual being who has come here to have a human experience and to show you what that is to progress through that, what that is to learn to be that expression of your spiritual self in your human experiences. And that's a part of what we're seeking to do and experience. Now, all the religious perspectives and descriptions and spirituality thing can sometimes complicate that for us, and sometimes it simplifies it for us. Okay? It's not a matter so much of if it complicates things or simplifies things for you, as it is about getting clear on your experience, because the principles that are key principles, that's the beautiful thing about this, is it's always going to show up again at another level. More contrast will emerge to help us better see with greater clarity. Great, we got this a little bit better. We've got room, we can work on this area. And instead of getting frustrated at this, I don't know, I'm a recovering perfectionist and people pleaser, right? So for me, it's often I have a perfected vision in my mind, right? And everything then is like a downgrade of that. And learning to have that progress mindset has allowed me to hold space for beautiful expectations and see the journey as a positive thing moving towards them rather than a falling or a failing. Okay. Anyways, a little bit of a tangent there on that bit, but I wanted to share all these things because I want to highlight the importance of the experience everyone had. Whatever your experience was this weekend, I hope you see the messages in those experiences. If you were just exhausted and you're feeling hurt and frustrated and just like, with everything going on, I hope you see that message as what it is, which I say this to my 4-year-old all the time. I'm like, oh, you got really angry about that. Do you know why? That anger is letting you know something's really important to you. So there's something really important to you. And I want to make sure that you acknowledge the importance of that and you give yourself credit for that. And that you acknowledge the human part of things and the need for a nervous system, space and reset, and how are you going to move through that, and how you're going to shift things and support yourself and be there for yourself. And I hope if this weekend was eye-opening for you and it was maybe a new thought and perspective where you're sitting here like, I still don't get it. I still don't really understand what this perspective or this viewpoint is. I still don't see why they're struggling, why these things matter. I hope that you still hold on to the things that are important to you, right? Because there are things that are just as important, right? And again, going back to the beginning where we talked about, there's a need for both of these experiences. And I genuinely believe there are women being called to stand in both places because it creates that momentum and is propelling us forward. And that propulsion is always moving in the direction of our continued growth and expansion. And the more we enjoy the journey and we relax into the process and we allow it to unfold as we can, and we learn to see some of those different steps that are taking place, like, again, I don't think it was a coincidence that the church brought this property, and then the interplay that happened here, right? This is what I mean. It just happens energetically. And sometimes the human part of us is more aware that we're playing into these things and we think that we are the ones causing it and setting it up. But most often it's that internal energy that's driving us, where you have, this article was announced back in December. And then the church a month later decides to do this celebration devotional, whether that was in conjunction with the original announcement or not, saying, hey, women should stay home. There was this energy in play of, hey, let's focus on women, let's highlight on women, let's bring some awareness about this. Well, that effort there caused a natural space for more voices and things to be heard, right? Which continued a conversation and will continue how things play out, right? The interesting general conference is one of our next big things coming up to look forward to see how that plays out. But again, it's just giving us another viewpoint of seeing this back and forth that's occurring here. Okay, question here. So if we feel called to focus on the feminine, do you think we follow that or have more of a goal to balance the feminine and the masculine within ourselves and our work? Thank you, Emily. So this is a question that it kind of depends on what you're looking at, what you're applying it to. I think maybe the best way I could say it is to come back to this perspective and viewpoint, which is we all have our masculine and feminine, and we need to integrate those two things, but also holding that feminine container. What does that look like? What does that feel like? And that's something that in sort of this process here that we move through, another way that I describe this process is we go through a journey of leaving the masculine, discovering the feminine, starting to embody the feminine, and then reintegrating the masculine. And collectively, we've been going through this 4-year process. 2020 started this journey for a lot of people of that divine departure, which is being called by the divine to go explore a new path and how we're moving forward and how we're progressing through that. And so for the last couple of years, that's been a big thing of women focusing on the feminine and identifying the feminine and enjoying it. And really this, I saw a lot of comments of like, women aren't standing for this anymore. Like they're speaking up, they're saying things, they're calling up. That's an indication of this embodiment starting to happen where it's the feminine energy is maturing, it's getting strong enough that it can be held there. But the next key piece is, okay, now that we've done that, how do we reintegrate that back into a relationship with the masculine? And here's what's really interesting about this process is if you look at it from this level, the masculine doesn't change energetically, right? Stays the same, stays the same, stays the same, stays the same. Only here does it start shifting a little bit. When this polarity change happens, that's when the big masculine rise happens that parallels the feminine rise that occurred here. And it's really important from an energetic perspective that the masculine doesn't change until later, because the masculine is here actually holding the ground of how things have been in order to give a foundation energetically for the feminine to step into this new level. But then it's really important that the masculine doesn't cross this shift into moving forward energy until the feminine is fully embodied and able to hold this space. And so I think going forward, we're going to see a little bit of this testing or teasing playing out here of like, women, are we really in a place where we can hold this ground and allow that masculine shift to take place? What that looks like, how that's going to unfold. I have ideas of what this is. I think it has to relate with, again, just embracing Heavenly Mother a little bit more. Again, there's different fractals of this, but that's kind of another idea, an example of like kind of where we are in this journey. And again, some of this masculine energy, it's maybe rising, but it's not yet like the things people want when they're like, oh, I want things to change. Like if I'm talking to a couple, like they're not going to see that until over here. There's a whole bunch of this is progress, 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 this is progress. And in fact, I'm still a little, the jury's still out for me on if we quite hit that point or not with this Instagram post, where one of the first things that the masculine does here when it's crossed over is it's just not stopping the feminine from moving forward or from having a conversation. And the comment and post that the church put there, if you haven't seen it, I don't have the exact words of quoting, but there's an acknowledgement of like, thank you for all the comments and feedbacks and the desire to share it with leaders. That's a bit of an acknowledgement there. I've heard different things about Instagram having lots of issues today. Lots of comments are not showing up, lots of different things. And so whether it's the church that went in and deleted all the comments, or if there's issues with Instagram just not showing the comments, I don't know. I also don't know the reasoning on that. I think there's multiple reasons of why those comments can be taken down. And it's easy to jump to, oh, look, they're silencing women again, and they don't want these comments shared, and oh, isn't that a problem? And I can see a couple of other like concerns too. Not wanting other people to like cause more drama. But again, I don't know, I'm not the church. I can also see them like taking it down. We're not quite sure how to have this conversation. We're not quite sure how to move forward in this, right? And the masculine has to figure out its own journey through this. Right? But so sort of in answering your question, what I think a lot of people are going through right now is relearning how to trust the masculine, how to integrate in the masculine, and how to allow the masculine to actually move to a rise. Because what will often happen for the feminine is if you're gonna have a pimple happen, it's gonna happen here, and a failure to rise. But if you make it past here, you're past the pimpling stage, what is more likely to occur, this is where you get the hyper feminine energy. And that is where the feminine sees, like back here in the early part of her journey, she's like, oh, I see something new. Like imagine this is a field of vision line. And it's like, I can see all of this potential progress here. Right? And I want us experiencing all of this space. And so she has that increased vision to be able to see that. And as she's moving forward, there's this tension that's kind of pulling her backwards, the natural energy. And she sometimes clings too much to this line and is trying to like pull and stay aligned with this perspective, which actually causes a wedge between the masculine and feminine energy. And so it can either like skew them both out of whack and slow down the ability for them to progress if the masculine like tries to follow, or it can create what it calls a bubble because the feminine separates. And so it's like this comes up here, and now there's a bubble in energy here. And when that happens, that bubble can ultimately pop and it can cause an end in the relationship and it breaks. Okay? And so that's part of the masculine's job is to try and keep the feminine from pulling up too much and to get her to go through this flip. I've done some posts in the past talking about this as like a version. Well, actually, we're not going to go there, but this is part of that feminine learning how to move into a new expression of her feminine energy. So this one was like the most comfortable current version she has. She discovers a new perspective, a new version of who she is and what she is, and then she has to learn how to bring that version into her own relationship with the masculine, right? So focusing on the feminine more might be learning how to bring this newfound feminine into relationship with the masculine. It's gonna be different, right? And it's also fractal in nature. So there's maybe some areas of your life where you are still needing to focus on the feminine. There are other areas where that integration is wanting to come back in. So it kind of depends as far as your question goes. But I think what this core piece is for a lot of women is it's like, oh, I am meant to be in this feminine expression, and I am meant to embody it, and I am meant to share it, and I am meant to cultivate it in others. That's part of what feminine energy does really well, right? But it's learning how do you integrate that masculine. So as far as how to do some of these things, like what do you do when the masculine is, where's it? Blocking things and preventing you from being able to rise? How do you recognize and avoid moving into this space so much? How do you transition into the flip? How are you supportive of this reintegration of the masculine? Those are all things that I go into more and teach in my programs and workshops and new things that I'm going to be doing. If you are interested in learning more, I'm going to be launching a fresh wave of it all here in the coming weeks. So if you want to get on the wait list, now's a perfect time. You can send me a DM, comment here below. That's a great way to learn about all of this. But I hope the message you take from this is whatever your thoughts and feelings and experiences and perspectives were this weekend, they're valid. And I just want to validate that, right? And I hope you're validating your experience. Secondly, there's so much here that is in common. And the more we can see those common desires, those common goals, the more it helps us break out of this trying to pull each other to our side and saying, oh, I figured it all out. No, I figured it all out, to emerging into a new experience that we're co-creating together. And that third piece being able to see all of these experiences, whether it's happening on a more public broad scale like what occurred this weekend, or if it's happening on more individual level scale, that there is a unfolding of this process and learning to see this as we're learning a new way of being in relationship. And for the relationship of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have had some pieces of this and the desired relationship in the past, but we've never actually experienced what I think a lot of people are craving in this interdependent masculine feminine relationship. And so it's new territory and it's new things to figure out. How do we integrate that? How do we move forward? How do we, we're rediscovering these parts of being in relationship. And anytime you're navigating a relationship rewiring, basically, you always have the option and the potential for it to turn into something that brings you further apart, or being able to say, I care about this and I want to learn how to bring that together. And what that looks like for you individually is going to be different. We all have different thoughts, we all have different experiences, we all have different circumstances, we all have different energy patterns, different generational things, different things that we're dealing with, different amounts of momentum, different beliefs and blocks, and all sorts of things that contribute to what that looks like. But there's a getting out of what does this look like for everyone, and into I can find this common space in every individual experience is valid and important. Everyone has common things we're moving forward, and we're all progressing as this unfolds. That's how the journey gets smoother. That's how it gets easier. And here's the big kicker. That's how it can be faster. We can start experiencing more of it the more we lower that resistance. And lowering resistance does not mean you can't share, you can't speak, or you can't whatever. I would never tell women not to do the things that they felt they were supposed to be doing. And I would never tell the church not to do things that they felt they were supposed to do, because both of them have important roles and parts to play in this. And the best way that we move forward is by each of them being able to do what they feel. And through that process, trusting the perfect circumstances are going to emerge that are going to allow each of us to see those ways that we've swung out too far and to find that middle ground around again and to navigate through it and to put it back into a place where it's not just, oh, I trust God or the universe or my heavenly parents are in charge and they're like orchestrating and taking care of it and I can sort of sit back. It holds space for, yeah, they're calling their shots because they're speaking here and they're speaking here and they're speaking here and they're speaking here to each of us individually and collectively and in different viewpoints and all the different subsets of this experience. They are aware of all of it and know exactly, oh, this experience with this one will cause this to happen and you're likely for this to occur. And when you can see it from that positive space, your desire to show up, your desire to continue seeking, your desire to keep learning is important. And I couldn't tell by looking at you what that was for you, because I don't know all the pieces that are going on. The best any of us can ever really do is to learn to follow our own direction. Teach a beautiful method on this if you want help with it. Just saying, is that my thoughts? Is that not? How do I tell if I'm being led away? Which does bring into another piece of like also understanding there's some certain principles and like being okay with those as like guiding principles, and also being okay with acknowledging you have to accept both outcomes, that you are right and you're moving forward with it and it's what you're supposed to do, and you're wrong and you're moving forward and it's going to be made clear to you the ways in which those adjustments can happen. Not that the wrongness is bad or failing, or we get really heavy and hard on that. And there's a reason, because sometimes if you're aware of those things ahead of time, it's really nice. I always use the example of like, I would love to know a good tax professional who's helping me file my taxes in ways so that I get a bigger refund than learning about it after the fact. And it's like, well, now I know and I can do it for next year. If I'd known a few different principles in the beginning, I could have experienced it sooner. Right? That's the key piece of it. Anyways, in summation, hope you had a wonderful weekend in whatever way you spent it. And the subsequent days that have gone through here. Yeah, if you want to learn more, you want to figure out, learn about all these fun things, come hang out with other women. You guys are going to be really excited about what I've been putting together. I've taken a lot of time to get intentional, to clear out a lot of space, say what is it that really is calling me, and then I feel like it's calling other women that they'd like to be a part of. So if you want to, again, get on the wait list for that, let me know. If you have more questions, thoughts, ideas, again, the replay of this is also on my YouTube channel, because I know that's sometimes easier to share or to like fast forward or double time the speed or things like that. So you can check it out on Emily Carolyn Maker on YouTube. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Okay. Oh, my goodness. I forgot to turn off the live here. Hey, hi YouTube. Thanks again for listening and watching. I hope you enjoyed it and have a wonderful rest of the day.